Good evening, everyone. This is our penultimate shiur on Hilchot Pesach, because obviously in 2 weeks' time will be B'dikat Chametz. And next week we return back throughout the summer for Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. We return back to 6 to 7. Okay? So let's get straight into it. We have loads to get through tonight, Be'ezrat Hashem. We will do as much as we can, and we will see what we need to cover next week. So we are in the middle of Siman Taf Nun Aleph 451. I'm just going to post here on the group, if you wish to be able to follow inside, the link for where we will be learning from. We reached Siman Taf Nun Aleph Seif Hey. So let's put that in the chat box. Okay. So what did we learn last week? Last week we talked about the Torah in Parshat Tzav, in Parshat Matot with Midian. We talked about earthenware, the problem with earthenware. We talked about the big debate with regards to absorption of something permissible or forbidden. And we said the Shulchan Aruch rules stringently here that we view chametz absorbed during the year as absorption of something prohibited, and therefore you need to do libun, although he does bring the other opinion, and therefore in certain circumstances one can add that as an additional leniency. We talked about the concept of rov tashmishah, by going according to the majority of the use of the utensil, the majority of it, and we'll see this play out again in some examples tonight in the Shulchan Aruch. And then we talked about how Hag'alat is done and how libun is done, and what to be careful about when doing Hag'alat. Okay, we didn't talk about the timing of Hag'alat. The timing of Hag'alat is something which we will see in the next chapter 552 about what exact time you need to do it. But let's continue where we were up to and get through as much as we can. So, Siman Taf Nun Aleph 451 Seif Hey. Kelim shnishtamesh ben behamin kefi tashmishan hechsheran. Anything which was used in conjunction with heat, the way it was used is the way it needs to be kashed. Im tashmishan bekli rishon. If it was used with a kli rishon, that means something which was cooked on the fire. Even though it's off the fire, it still retains the heat as long as it's yad soledet bo. Kegon kaf shemegisim ba bakdera. For example, even not just the pot, but even the ladle or the ladle or the spoon which you stir the pot. Tzarich lachshiram bli kli rishon. This then needs to be kashed in a kli rishon, because it absorbed heat on the fire or in a pot which was cooked, boiling heat on the fire, and you put in the pot, you put in the ladle, you put in the spoon, it needs to be kashed in a kli rishon, which means that you need to boil up the water on the fire. You can take it off the fire and put in the ladle, put in whatever it needs to be. And if it's a pot, you need to put the pot into a bigger pot in order to kasher the entire pot. A utensil which is used by pouring onto it. Sorry, I missed out a line. If it's only used in conjunction with a kli sheni, then it needs to be kashed in a kli. It can be kashed in a kli. Of course, it can be kashed in a kli rishon, but it can even be kashed in a kli sheni. So I presume you all know what kli sheni and kli rishon is. Of course, as we know from the Chot Shabbat, kli sheni is the second utensil, i.e., it's been poured from the pot which was cooked on the fire into a second pot. Now this is let's just finish off and we'll discuss a few points here. A utensil which you pour onto it, you cannot kasher it using a kli sheni, you have to pour on it from a kli rishon. Straightforward. If it absorbed hametz with a kli rishon, then it needs to be kashered in a kli rishon. If it absorbed hametz through pouring onto it, you can kasher it through pouring onto it. If it absorbed hametz through a kli sheni, i.e., you have you poured hot soup directly from the pot into a bowl, without something in between. You poured it in, that then becomes that bowl a kli sheni, and that has got spaghetti in it and all kinds of hametz in it. So you spoon into it. That's a kli sheni. That needs to be kashered in a kli sheni, at least. It can be kashered kli rishon, be kashered kli sheni. So the couple of important points here. Firstly, is that we have a principle in Chot Shabbat, kli sheni eno mevashel. A secondary utensil does not cook. Almost everything. There are very few exceptions to this. That's what we Sfaradim hold, at least. And there are very few exceptions to this. Something which is called in Hilchot Shabbat kalei habishul, extremely easily to be cooked. And there are very few examples given of this. Fish which has been salted for a long, long time. And other pure tea leaves, something like that. That perhaps can be cooked with a kli sheni, with a secondary utensil. But generally speaking, kli sheni b'Hashem, which is why when you make a tea, for example, you make coffee on Shabbat, we don't hold that you need to have a kli shlishi and all of these things if you're not using tea leaves. If you're using mint leaves, then true. Mint leaves, you would need to put it in a kli shlishi. But the tea bags which we have, which you normally use, it's very simple. You pour from the urn into a cup. That cup is kli sheni. You can now put your coffee in, you can put your tea bag in, and that's all fine. That's clear in Shulchan Aruch, that's permissible. But here he seems to be saying, now if kli sheni eno mevashel, if it doesn't cook, then why would you need to kasher it? And here he's saying clearly, if something absorbed hametz in a secondary utensil needs to be kashered through at least through a secondary utensil. So what's the reason for this? So here there's an important principle. I'm going to share the screen here just for this. This takes us to the laws of kashrut in Yoredeya. Is it sharing the screen? Can you see the screen? Oh no. Let's revert it. Let's try once more. It may have happening again. Okay, don't worry about it. I'll just have to sort this out again. Okay, so in any case, what the Shulchan Aruch tells us in the halachot of kashrut is that kli sheni doesn't cook. But there are opinions which say that although it can't cook, it can absorb and expel. And he brings two opinions with this, and he concludes, it's good in the first instance to be particular, that a kli sheni, although it doesn't cook, it does absorb and expel. So this is why he's writing here, in the first instance, we kasher kli sheni, we kasher things which have been used in conjunction with a secondary utensil. So this doesn't affect what we've learned in Hilchot Shabbat in the past, because Shulchan Aruch is clear, and this is the opinion of the Gemara and the Rishonim, that kli sheni doesn't cook. The reason why the Ashkenazim are stringent is because they say nowadays we don't know what's considered a light, something cooked light. But the Gemara says clearly, kli sheni eno mevashel, that's undisputed. A secondary cup doesn't cook the vast majority of things. However, with regards to whether it can absorb and expel, here there are two opinions in the Rishonim, and therefore Maran in Hilchot Kashrut was posek in Siman Kufhei 105 in Yoredeya that it can potentially absorb and expel, and therefore one needs to kasher that, which would mean, according to this, spoons, knives, and forks, which we used in conjunction with hametz throughout the year, does need to be dipped into a kli rishon or a kli sheni. So, I don't know why you would want to do with a kli sheni specifically, but the point is you can just dip it in, but it needs to be dipped in. Okay, so that's important to bear in mind, that although kli sheni doesn't cook with regards to Shabbat, with regards to kashrut throughout the year and also on Pesach, it can perhaps absorb and expel. However, Mishnah Berurah already writes this is all a chatehila in the first instance. If a person b'di'avad didn't kasher it and used it, it's fine. B'di'avad, it's fine, because one can rely on the lenient opinions. But in the first instance, we kasher also secondary utensils. Or certainly wouldn't be necessary is kli shelishi, a third utensil, which means as follows. If you use spoons in bowls of soup, and those bowls of soup have hametz in them, but you never pour directly from the pot into the bowl. You always use a ladle. Now, that status of that ladle, certainly if it's not a metal ladle, if it's a plastic ladle, then I think we can assume that the ladle becomes a kli sheni, and then the bowl becomes a kli shlishi, and therefore the spoons which you use with the bowl are all fine, just be washed, don't need to be kasher at all. Even if once it happened that you didn't use a ladle, but fine. But throughout the year, normally this is what I do. I always use a ladle. Even if it was a metal ladle which conducts easily. So here some of the poskim say that because it conducts, and it's especially if when you serve, you keep the ladle in the soup. You pass the bowl, and then the ladle is sitting in the soup. So then perhaps some say it takes on the same status as kli rishon, which is an opinion. It's a big mahloket. But here we got a double chumrah here. Does kli sheni at all absorb? And is this a kli sheni? I think here one can be lenient here. It's sveka, doubling. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying? Because the fact that kli sheni absorbs and expels is in itself a mahloket. And whether a ladle is considered a kli rishon is in itself a mahloket. To say that we're going to say the ladle becomes a kli rishon and the bowl is considered kli sheni and kli sheni absorbs and expels, that's already a stringency, and therefore one could be lenient. And based on what we learned last week, you go according to the majority of the use of it. If you normally always use ladles throughout the year, that's fine, you wouldn't need to kasher that. Okay, in practice, we throw everything in. If you're going to be using on Pesach, we throw everything in if you don't have new cutlery. But it's important to know this, that these principles, that kli sheni can be kashered in a kli sheni, when we do so in order to accommodate all opinions. The other final thing to bear in mind, which is what happens nowadays when we do kashering, is that although he said kli rishon can be kashered with a kli rishon, that means, strictly speaking, you can take a pot, boil it on the fire, big pot, take it off the fire, and then dip in your cutlery, dip in your cups, dip in everything you want to dip in. And even dip in smaller pots which fit into that pot. Yeah? Obviously that's what we're doing. But if those pots were used on the fire, then although the Shulchan Aruch doesn't write this, the later poskim say that because it was used on the fire, it needs to be kashered by hot water on the fire. I.e., even if you heated the pot till boiling point, and the water's steaming, and now you've switched the fire off, and now you dip in the pot, you should say that's okay. That's kli rishon absorbed. It's kashering in a kli rishon. In the first instance, and this is what we do today, when you go to big places and they do Hag'alat, they keep the fire underneath the pot on constantly. So that to accommodate the opinion which holds that since it absorbed through the kli rishon, which was on the fire, has to then be kashered with the kli rishon on the fire. And that's how Mishnah Berurah posek, and that's how even we take on in the first instance we do. And therefore, when you're kashering a home, you're using a pot and you're putting in another smaller pot, if that pot has been used on the fire, then you should ensure, in the first instance at the very least, that when you're putting it into the other pot, that pot should be on the fire, i.e. the heating on underneath it, aside from the water inside it boiling. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good. The final point we need to be aware of is with regards to pouring. So we said something which is absorbed with pouring can be kashered with pouring. This is why we kasher our sinks, for example, just with pouring. Because how would the sink have absorbed chametz? In the rare instance that you had chametz dishes and it was hot enough, the heat was hot enough that it directly got the stream of boiling hot water onto it, and then it touched the walls of the sink. That's why we do irui kli rishon, we pour hot water onto the side. Of course, that's sufficient because that's the way it was absorbed. What needs to be understood is that 2 points. Firstly, is that irui needs to be a straight and smooth pouring. What's called in the poskim shelo nifsaka kiluach, which means that the stream of the water doesn't. For example, if I want to kasher the base of the sink, and I poured on the walls, and then that fell on the base of the sink, that doesn't work, because that's not a direct stream. Does that make sense? It has to be a direct stream. And therefore, when kashering one sink, people say they kasher sink, but means you have to do it. It has to be in a way in which firstly you start with the bottom, or the base, and you pour directly onto the base, with not on the sides, then falling onto the base. And then you pour onto the walls on the side. Because there needs to be a direct stream. The second thing we need to be aware of is that irui, kashering through pouring out, has to be that it hits dry material. Because otherwise, the moment it hits something which isn't hot anymore, i.e. if there's cold liquid there, then it stops its ability to be able to kasher. Because irui mevashel kedei klipa, irui can only cook the very small peel. So if there's something there, a bit of cold water, it doesn't work. This is why I'm saying when you kasher sink, you always start from the bottom, just practically speaking. Because if you start on the walls, then you're going to have to kasher the walls and then dry the basin, the base of the sink, and then start again. Here you start on the base, you pour in circular fashion around the base of the sink, as much as is possible, obviously, and then you make your way around the walls, ensuring, of course, that the walls and the basin of the sink are all totally dry in order to be able to do irui properly. Good? Okay. Let's now move on to Seif Zayin, because we learned Seif 6 last time. That was with the concept of Rov Tashmishah, the majority use of the utensil. So let's go, we're going to pick out the main halachot, which are relevant here. So Seif Zayin. Yesh misha omer de kapot ha'asiyot mikeren. I just wanted to learn this, just an interesting point here. Spoons or utensils made from ivory. Elem takana bagala. You can't kasher them. Why should you not be able to kasher ivory? Because it's such a precious material and it gets easily ruined with boiling hot water. We're concerned that you're never going to do it properly. This is this is not from the Gemara. Everything which we've learned so far is basically from the Gemara. But this is one of the Rishonim came along and said something which is very expensive and very precious and normally you wouldn't use in conjunction with hot water, it's forbidden. You can't kasher it really because we're concerned, although kashering does work, but you're not going to do the kashering properly. You won't heat the water up high enough, you won't dip it in properly, and so on and so forth. Now I was trying to think of any practical applications of this. Is there anything, utensils which are really expensive, which you wouldn't want to be in hot water nowadays? I'm not sure, I couldn't really think of anything, but in theory, if there was to be something which is very expensive and you only use it with coal, but then miman of shach, if you only use it with coal, then you don't need to do Hag'alat to it. They're talking about where you used it with ma'im hamin, and nonetheless, it's very precious, so you're going to be concerned that you're not going to do Hag'alat to it properly. Okay. Is there such a thing as ivory utensils nowadays? I don't ever come across that? No? That's in the past. Okay. Fine. Next, 8. Sif het. Had kli etz, vehad kli even, vehad kli matechet, dinam nachshiram ba'hag'ala, v'chen kli etzem tsichim hag'ala. Wood, stone, metal, and bone can all be kashered with the regular things, either with hag'ala or with the bone, depending on the circumstance. I often get asked around Pesach time, is it true, people, especially people building kitchens, quartz, what do I have to make the sink from? Right, you can make quartz is fine. Quartz can be kashered, because it's a kind of stone. So that's learned from here. It's fine to kasher these kinds of things. Okay, good. That's Sif Chet. Sif Tet we will learn together with the next chapter. So let's skip that out. It's got to do with the timing. Let's now go to Sif Yud. Now Sif Yud is a rare instance, but there's a really important principle here, one which we touched on a few weeks ago. It's worth repeating again. Salim shemorhim baim basar. Baskets you salt the meat in. So they used to have special utensils where they would salt the meat the entire year round. In those days, the people salted their meat, didn't just buy it salted from the shop. Yesh matzichim hagala. Some say you need to do hagala. Yesh misheholek, and some disagree. Even in dvarav, and that opinion is correct. The second opinion is correct. So why would you need to do hagala to? Why would you need to do hagala to baskets where you're salting meat in? There's no hametz there. So this opinion holds, two opinions of the Rishon. This opinion holds that perhaps whilst you were salting the meat, there was some hametz there. And when you salt something very heavily, it can absorb and extract. And although of course, everyone agrees if that happened on a regular basis, then you'll need to kasher it. Yeah? because that's hametz. But we're talking about, we don't know. Do we have to be concerned that perhaps with the meat there was some with the salt in the meat there was some crumbs of bread, in the same basket? So the first opinion says do Hag'alat because perhaps there was some bread there, and if there was some bread there, then it's going to be a problem that it's going to make it hametz. But the second opinion says no. Why not? Who could remember based on what we learned? We learned this about 5-6 weeks ago. What would be the reason why you don't need to kasher it? Anyone remember?
You'd have to assume there's
because precisely. Well done, Robert. Thank you. As Mishnah Berurah points out here, "Hazikurei isura lo mahzikinan." Don't assume there is hametz lurking in every corner trying to catch you out. Right? If you know there's hametz there, you have to kasher it once. If you know there's hametz there, you have to kasher it. But if you don't know, why should you assume? And that's Shulchan Aruch holds in similar to what we learned earlier in chapter 447 in Sif Hey. The Shulchan Aruch holds lo mahzikin b'surah. We do not assume there is hametz. For both of these reasons we explained a few weeks ago, this is why we can buy plain ingredients before Pesach without Kasher, because firstly the whole concept of reawakening, and secondly, even if it does reawaken, why assume that there's going to be hametz there? And that's this principle. And therefore we see again, second time, this principle, we don't need to assume there's hametz when there's no reason to do so. In terms of plastic, one question asked here was, what about plastic? So this is a very modern question, of course, because plastic is a new thing. What's the status of plastic? There is an extreme opinion which says plastic has the same status of glass, really, and like glass for the Ashkenazim cannot be kashered, so to plastic can be kashered. The general consensus is that either plastic doesn't need to be kashered at all, which, from my very little understanding of science, seems to be the most logical understanding. But even those who, in practice, what we say is now we kasher it. We do kasher, and plastic can be kashered. It is true that there is an opinion which says that plastic can't be kashered, but in practice, the poskim don't really follow that. Plastic can be kashered, and we do kasher it in practice. We do kasher it. Okay, yes, Robert.
I'm on mute. Sorry, I don't really understand the salting question because there's no heat involved. So why do what's
if you leave salt in it for a long period of time, certainly me'et le'et, for 24, even without, if you're salting with very strong salt, it has the ability to extract and expel with the salt.
So we're saying that the walls of the vessel that's holding the salt and the meat, because of the the strength or the caustic nature of the salt, it will absorb something.
If there's hametz there, correct? Yeah.
Right, and then hang on a minute. Then, so does that mean that Hag'alat would take it out, or would you say no? You have to use salt to take it out because
no. Of course, Hag'alat can take out because then the taste is absorbed in the walls, and that can be extracted by.
But I thought we have a principle that says Hag'alat doesn't take flavor that went in through heat. Now, how come it can take flavor that goes in through salt? Through dry heat. If I stuck a metal knife in the barbecue with chametz, right, and then putting it in Hag'alat is going to do nothing, halachically speaking, right? It doesn't make any difference. I still got to do libun.
Yeah, because that's because because that's because in dry heat, salt doesn't have that. Something with salt doesn't have that ability as libun. It's considered the status of Hag'alat. Worse, the heat has the ability to extract from the walls of the pot.
Okay, so we're saying there is a hierarchy then, right?
Of course.
So it's not exclusively just as it goes in that goes out. We're saying that I suppose, look, if you did libun on something that only needed Hag'alat, it would still be kosher. It doesn't work.
Of course, certainly. Yeah. Just like Kli Rishon would work for Kli Sheni, and like Kli Rishon works for Irui, even though you're not doing it the way it's absorbed. If you do it in the stronger way, of course you could do it by resalting it out and leaving it in with something there. Of course you could do that, but.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we move on. So now we've talked about Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Irui. We've talked about ivory. We've talked about wood, stone, metal, bone. And now this principle of the basins of the meat, that we don't have to worry about it because Lo Mahazikim Yisrael, we don't assume the prohibition. Now we want to see 11. And this is really practical, this. Mahavat shemetagnim ba muteret b'Hag'alah. So a pan which you fry oil in it with other things can be kashered with Hag'alat. Ve'im hi aruka, and if it's very long, you can't put it in a pot. Mesim hetzia v'ofech od umesim hetzia ha'acher. So that this is a really important. We've touched this in the past, but tevilat kelim, when you immerse utensil, and utensil has to be dipped in one go, like a woman goes to the mikveh in one go. You can't miss one bit, and if you miss one bit, you have to do the whole thing all over again. When it comes to Hag'alat, though, Hag'alat is not about a new status, about kasher and getting rid of all, and therefore you can do it in parts. You can do half this and half the other parts. That's fine. Okay, if it's extremely long, then you do libun in the middle. You do Hag'alat to the sides, libun in the middle. Okay, fine. And then the Rama says, actually, for frying pans, you do libun for the whole thing. So this is a really important mahloket rishonim between the Rosh and the Rashba. Let's think about this. Let's not talk about Teflon and non-stick pans now. Let's talk about regular, let's go back a few years, regular pans, where you fry your eggs in, and you put in, with your eggs, you put bread. Now, let's think about this. If you never use any liquid, then that's going to need libun, of course, based on the principles we've learned. But the reality is, how do people cook in pans? They use oil. They use water, they use oil. Sometimes it burns. Still, the Rosh says, even though it burns still, nonetheless, somehow there still is some lahluhit, there still is some kind of moisture there. And therefore, as long as you cook together with oil, even if the pot became burnt, you can still kash with Hag'alat. You understand the problem? The Rashba, however, said no. He says, if you're going to be, sometimes it dries up and it gets burnt, and therefore there's no more longer liquid, and therefore for those moments it becomes, you need libun to do it. So this is why with regular pans, I'm not talking about Teflon, non-stick, regular pans, where we use oil with it, the Shulchan Aruch's opinion is like the Rosh, that we can assume that it is, that there's enough liquid there, and therefore one can kasher it with Hag'alat, as long as you're using oil and liquid, and that's what we do. Once one of my kids took out the pan and made some eggs, and they never bothered to put oil in, still it's fine. Why? Because of Rov Tashmish, the majority of its use. Since the majority of the time it's not used like in this fashion, it's permissible. The Rama, however, takes on the stricter opinion, and he says no, it needs libun because perhaps sometimes it gets burnt and there's no liquid left, and therefore heat was absorbed without any liquid, and therefore it needs libun. However, the Rama himself says, because of various, think about it, number one is based on what we've learned in the past, hetera bala. You remember we learned that hametz is hetera bala. Now that's a mahloket, we paskin lechumra. But together with that, together with the opinions which say Hag'alat is sufficient, the Rama compromises and he says you can do libun kal. Libun kal, as we explained last week, is a much lighter form of libun, and that form of libun is essentially putting something into the oven for about half an hour. That's already considered libun kal. And so if you want Ashkenazim, they can get away with doing that, putting the pan in the oven, putting it on the high temperature for half an hour. They could, even if they want to accommodate the Rama. But for us, you don't need to do that. Hag'alat suffices. The problem, though, is when it comes to Teflon. The whole purpose of these Teflon non-stick pans nowadays is that you put in a drop of oil, but the whole purpose of it is that it's meant to be non-stick, it's meant to be all dry. That's the whole purpose of it. And therefore, my understanding, at least what I've discussed with the other Hachamim in previous years when I've been presented with this question, is that Hag'alat perhaps would not suffice for that. That needs libun. Now, if you do libun, proper libun, you're probably going to destroy the pan. So it's probably not worth doing it, just putting it away and buying a Pesach one. Although, those who do Hag'alat to it, I wouldn't say they're doing anything wrong. I'm not going to say that you should do that, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, let's just go through the various things here. Firstly, hetera bala, right? You have that always in the background. You don't need to do libun at all. Secondly, what's the definition of libun? Perhaps I can just put it in the oven for half an hour. satisfies libun. That's a minority opinion, but that's another reason to be lenient. And thirdly, is this really considered dry enough? Is this really dry enough? Okay, all of these points together, it would seem that those who do it with Hag'alat, it's fine. If people ask me, I would say no. Non-stick Teflons you should put away and buy ones for Pesach. Right? Very few things you have to buy new for Pesach. This is perhaps one of the things you need to. Yeah. Okay. Final point on this seif before we take questions is that the Mishnah Berurah points out an important point, which is also really relevant in Mishnah Berurah 65. He says, yes, although I've told you about these pots and these pans and everything, but the tavnit, what's tavnit in English? The cake, like when you bake a cake, you put it in a
oven tray.
Oven trays or cake trays, right? These kinds of things, you need libun to be kashered. They're going to need libun to be kashered, and you can't kasher with Hag'alat because it's all dry. Okay, and therefore, if you are going to kasher them, it has to be kashered with libun. And libun, as we said, is putting the really, really the highest temperature and leaving it on and kashering it through that. And very often, from what I've been told, is that oven trays get ruined if you do that. If you do self-clean, oven trays get ruined, and therefore, again, same thing. If that's going to be the case, then put them out and use kasher Pesach ones, or just don't use, whatever. Just, it's hard. If you want to kasher, you have to leave it in the oven on the highest temperature. Okay, yes, Robert, questions, we'll move on to next eve.
It's a very simple question, right? The fact that oil cooks at a higher temperature than water we ignore, correct? Because, you put it in with the oil, and it gets a much warmer temperature than when you've done the 100 degrees you can do the Hag'alat. So, perhaps you could say how it goes in isn't how it's coming out. But we don't worry about that.
You mean it's being absorbed through the oil, and the oil is a hotter temperature than the water, and therefore you should need a higher temperature to kasher. Is that what you're asking?
That's what I'm asking. That's what I've wondered about that for many, many years, and it seems we don't worry about that. We use water, and that's what we do.
Very interesting. I never thought about that. I never come across that. Clearly,
I haven't checked. I need to check my science, but I'm pretty sure that when you fry in like vegetable oil, the temperature you're at is more than 100 degrees.
Really?
Right, but I can go and ask Google now and then while I'm
look, in practice, none of the poskim ever said anything about that. In practice, I'm not going to change the halakha. You asked a good question. Why is that the case? We need to investigate that and understand the science and see what can be said about that. But good point. Okay, fine. Let's move on now to Seif Yud Bet. Kol hakelim tzarich lag'il yedotehem kemotan. All utensils, you also have to kasher the handles. Now, let's work this through. The Mishnah Berurah asks the question. He says, I understand why you need to do that for metal. Because metal conducts. And so, forbidden taste in the water of the pot can go through to the handle of the pot. So that's why, certainly metal pots. But why is it, he says, the other utensils, wooden ones for example, why would you need to kasher the handle of the pot? And he says that perhaps, when you're washing it, you think, or your hands are full of hamet, you put, they can't put some kind of chashash, some concern, that perhaps it absorbs hamet in some way. But that's just interesting to point out that the Shulchan Aruch does insist, and this is what we do in practice nowadays when we kasher utensils, even ones which don't conduct easily, we do kasher the entire, even the handles, and we're going to see later in the Shulchan Aruch, even the lids. All right, the lids, for sure you need to, yeah. But here the Shulchan Aruch is insisting that one needs to also kasher it. However, says the Rama, mium lo higiru hayadot en ne'esor b'di'avad. He says, b'di'avad, one can be lenient. Why? I what about metal utensils? Metal utensils went through. So he says very simple, because there's a good logic to say you don't need to kasher the handles. Why? Because just like we say the handles absorbed heat through the walls of the hametz and it traveled through, so too when I'm kashering it, that heat as well kashers the wall and travels through to the handle. So that's one way of looking at it. The question is there enough time, etc., etc.? Okay, all of that. Therefore, b'di'avad, he says one can't be lenient to them. In the first instance, we need to kasher the handles. If one didn't kasher handles of a utensil, one can still use that pot on that pot, and you cooked in that pot, it can be eaten on Pesach. Good? Okay. Let's skip out 13. Seafood Gimel talks about a pot which you mended. Yeah, you fixed the pot and it's not really relevant. So let's go to 14, Seafood Dalit. You basically had a pot which had a hole in it, you fixed it, how do you kasher it and all of that. Okay. Seafood Dalit. Kisui shel barzel, the lid, shemechasim b'agdera, tzarich ha'agala, needs hagala. Why? Kevan shemazia b'chor sham mechoma kedera. Because it receives the evaporation and the perspiration from the food inside the pot. And if you put a lid which wasn't kashered on a Pesach pot on Pesach, the whole pot will be forbidden. All the contents of the pot will be forbidden. Why? Because on Pesach, even a drop is a problem. And therefore, here it's going to be an issue. And so, this is why we also kasher the lids of something. Okay, if you put on Erev Pesach, if this happened on Erev Pesach after 6 hours, it would be fine if there was 60 times more, which likely to be, or if it hadn't been used for a day, because then remember, let's just do quick Hazara. Firstly, everyone agrees from Chatzot till Pesach, 1 in 60 works. And secondly, we also hold Sfaradim, then Oten Tam Nifgam is mutar. If something hasn't been used for 24 hours with Hametz, although you shouldn't use in the first instance, if it was used, but the Avad, it's permissible to be eaten. So in those instances on Erev Pesach, it will be fine. But on Pesach itself, by mistake, you took out a lid and you put that lid, then the whole food would be forbidden to be used on Pesach.
Sorry, can I just clarify? You said from Chatzot, is there a machloket about whether 1/60th works?
No, everyone agrees.
Everybody agrees.
Yeah, everyone agrees to that. That's, in fact, those who hold that Chametz reawakens, for when does it, for what's the point of Bitul then? The point of Bitul is for those hours. Okay, the next few Seifim, 16, 17, 18, 19, are very specific kinds of things. Let's now go to Seif Chaf. This is where, I'm just trying to extract the main points. This is where the whole concept of covering, people cover up their kitchens, like some people even do it like a space room, right? So high, yeah? This is where it originated from. Because think about it, basically everything we've learned so far, what do you need to cover anything for? If you do kashering properly, based on the principles we learned, you don't cover anything. Why do we kasher our kitchen? I talked about sinks. Why do we kasher our kitchen surfaces? Because perhaps during the year, hot food fell from a Kli Rishon. It happens. It happens. It spills over from the Kli Rishon. So that's being absorbed through either Irui or through Kli Sheni. So they need to be kashered. But that can just be kashered simply by pouring on top of it. So if you do Irui to the kitchen's surfaces, there's no need to cover it. So where did this whole covering business come from? Says the Shulchan Aruch, Seif Chaf, HaShulchanot v'atevot, tables and boxes, where you keep food the entire year, you put food and you keep food there the entire year. What we do is in practice we do pour hot water on them, because sometimes soup falls onto the table. Now if you never bring your pot to the table, you have that kind of family where you never bring pots to the table. Some families are like that. There's no need to kasher your table or to put any covering on your table. Because what's the problem? You're bringing in the bowl the bowl is a kli sheni, and perhaps it spilled from the bowl into the table, that's pouring out from a kli sheni, no problem with that. But sometimes people bring the pots onto the table, and sometimes that spills. And so therefore it became customary to the Shulchan Aruch. What we do is we kasher the tables, and we kasher the boxes where we store hametz in them. We kasher by pouring hot water on it. Now the Mishnah Berurah writes in 115, I'll just read it out for you. Some say, this is Magen Avraham, even once you kasher, you need to put on a tablecloth on it. Why? Perhaps there still is some hametz there. Okay, this is what the Rabbah says, you should do this at least with boxes. It's almost impossible to get every drop out. But with table, it says you don't need to worry about. So again, Avraham comes up with something. I never understood why. Why are we concerned more here than any other place? He says, perhaps you didn't do the Hag'alat properly. Perhaps there still is some hametz remaining. And therefore he says, although you kasher the table by pouring hot water on it, you should still put an additional sheet on it. So just in case there was still any hametz left over after kashering, you're doubly protected. Why don't we say that anything else? Yeah. Anyway, the Rabbah disagrees, and he says, no, you don't have to worry about that. If it's a table, it's a straight table, no need to, you can kasher it. Now, obviously, nowadays, we don't want to pour hot water onto our tables, although it seems they used to do that. Therefore, that's why we cover our tables nowadays. But you could do either. If you didn't want to cover your table, you could just pour hot water on the table, and that would be fine. Well, so this is the origin, this is the first mention, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first mention of covering as well. So, Magen Avraham. Okay, and again, I don't understand why he's saying we're concerned that perhaps there's hametz when we don't say anything else. That's what he says. So this is very origin. What the Rabbah says is, he says, I disagree with that, but he says in cupboards, and for all intents and purposes, nowadays what that means is for our fridge and freezer, for example, there, it's very hard to get rid of every drop. Now, remember, a drop on Pesach hametz is in Isur Doraita by itself. And so he says that you should cover up. You should cover that up. Okay, and that's general advice which we give, right? Which is where you're going to be putting food on, and remember also, don't forget another point I want to point out. In the old days, didn't have all the packaging which we have nowadays. Yeah, and so he's rightly concerned, the Rabbah. You're putting in your dried fruits, your nuts, and you don't have these big packages, plastic packages, and you're putting it onto the surface area, and perhaps there's a drop there. So therefore cover it up. Accept it. But if you only keep in the fridge things which are plastic wrapped, covered up, there's nothing to worry about. But let's say fruit and veg, which you put, directly into the fridge, then that, based on this Rabbah here in the Mishnah Berurah, this is the source that one should try to cover up those. One should cover up those cupboards in the fridge or any other place in the house where you're storing food and the food is not being wrapped, and that cupboard was used for hametz, then you should cover it with something. But this is the whole origin of where this whole covering and wrapping comes from this Mishnah Berurah. Good? Okay, so having said all of that, now we get to cold, and then we'll get to glass. 22. Let's get back 21, talks about beer, barrels of beer. 22. Kol Kelim, afilu shel heres. All utensils, even earthenware ones which we learned last week, are very, very hard. Robert asks the food pantry, it's a good point, the introduction to the Seif actually. The food pantry is cold, what's the problem? Answer is, we're going to see in the Seif, that even cold, if it stayed for 24 hours consecutively, and obviously without packaging, think back to olden times, let's say you put bread in your cupboard, or you put crackers, without any covering, pure crackers into the cupboard, and it's kept there for 24 hours on the surface, then it can absorb, by the way. We're going to see that now. That's a good point. כל הכלים, אפילו של חרס, all utensils, even other ones, שנשתמש בהם בחמץ בצונן, which were used only with cold חמץ throughout the year, מותר להשתמש במועצה אפילו בחמץ, you can use them for Pesach food, even hot Pesach food. Chutz, there's two exceptions to this. Number one is bet saor, number two is bet haroset. Yeast house, and also a house with a utensil where they make haroset in it. A utensil where they make yeast in it, and a utensil where they make haroset in it. She'af al pi shelosh chametz el betzonen, even though you only used cold there, asur lishtamesh ben matzah behamin, you cannot use hot water, hot chametz there. Aval betzonen, if it's cold, mulaniach behem matzah fiyah mutar, aval lo shlosh ben full stop. Says Shulchan Aruch, if it's been used with cold the entire year round, it's fine. It's fine. But, and even earthenware vessels, which are used to put proper bread in, that's fine. Aside though from a bet se'or. What's a bet se'or? A bet se'or is a place where the woman makes the bread and kneads there. And so there, often you would leave the hametz there for an extended period of time. And since if it's left there me'et le'et for 24 hours consecutively, then it has the ability to absorb even cold. This is concept of kavush kimbushal in Yoredea. Even cold can absorb if it's left there for 24 hours. Okay, that's number one. And number two is bet haroset. What's a bet haroset? Bet haroset is a place where they make haroset with very sharp spices. So, because they put their sharp spices, even if it wasn't kept there for 24 hours, if it's cold and used in conjunction with very sharp things, which for what we hold sharp is things like garlic and onion and ginger, these kinds of things, that would be, and you use that in conjunction with hametz, then that would be a problem. That would be a problem. Okay? So therefore you couldn't use that unless you kashered it. But otherwise, you would be able to use it freely, even with hot things. And even if it was used cold, in either for an extended period of time, it was kept there, or it was used with sharp things, where we said that you can't use it unless you kasher it. Firstly, you can kasher it. And number two is, you can, remember, use it for cold things in it. We did learn this last week. We can use it for cold as long as it's not being done on a regular basis. On a temporary basis, permissible. Continues the Shulchan Aruch. The cold ze below Hag'alat is all if you didn't kasher it. Aval al Hag'alat afilu betzor bethaus mutarim in Hashaheres. Even this haroset place, even the yeast place, where you can kasher it as long as it's not earthenware. Aval sheches or man Hag'alat, earthenware never works. Afilu shlem ha'etz etzonen, even if it was only used with cold, but still it was kept there for 24 hours, or used with sharp things, earthenware cannot be kashered, that you could only be able to use it for cold things. V'ha'idna nowadays, nahagu alma delosh tomush b'pischa b'manid b'pahara atike. We don't use nowadays earthenware vessels, old ones, because of these concerns. Kashering, right? We just generally don't use earthenware vessels on Pesach. It's become customary. So to summarize, what we've seen here is we've seen the two things all the way through the chapter, Hag'alat and Libun. And now we are seeing a third one, which is you just have to wash it away, and you can use it if it was used with cold. But two caveats to that is, cold wasn't used in conjunction with with sharp stuff, and two, it wasn't used in conjunction with in a place where it was left there for an extended period of time, because then it would be a problem. Is that clear? And even if it is a problem, you can kasher it aside from earthenware. And even if you didn't kasher it, you could use it temporarily. You could use it on an odd occasion to put cold things in. Robert, really quickly, can you wait, Robert? Is it a really quick question, or because I only got 10 minutes? I want to finish.
No, I can wait. It's a very quick question, though.
Go. Okay, 23.
Okay, so the quick question was, the knife I use to cut onions, as long as I don't cut onions with bread, I can use it on Pesach.
Correct.
Just wash it.
But
if I use it with onions on bread, I've got onions and bread together, then I have to kasher it.
Even though it's all cold, very good practice application. Even though it's all cold, still you're going to have to kasher that. How would you kasher it? You kasher it with, that would need Hag'alat. Yeah. Okay, good. 23, this is an important point, and we're going to discuss this when we go through all the practical things next week. Klei cheres hametzapin beituch zechuchit dinam kichli cheres. Earthenware utensils which are covered with glass have the status of earthenware. So even though we're going to learn very soon, the next halakha we're going to learn that glass doesn't absorb, and therefore one can use glass freely on Pesach and throughout the year. So here I've got an earthenware vessel, and it's glazed with glass. Nonetheless, it's asur. Why? So the poskim writes that they say, look, because when it was made the glass together with the earthenware, it somehow has the ability to become porous again. Don't ask me for the explanation of the science here, okay? But what we're being told is, because they're made in that manner, it somehow has the ability to become porous once again, and therefore it doesn't help to say that it's got glass on the outside. It's still asur if it's china, with glazed china, it's still forbidden. But be careful to distinguish this from an oven with glass on top. The whole svara, the whole reason why it's a problem is because they were made together. It was glazed. It was made together. Whatever. You got an oven which has glass on it. That doesn't need to be kasher for Pesach. Yeah, it doesn't be kasher. People don't know this. Right? You got a glass induction hob with glass on top. Just clean it very, very well with some soap, with some detergent. Clean it very, very well, and that's it. You don't have to pour boiling hot water and all of that. None of that, because it's glass and there's a glass cover on top. It's not glazed. It's not like together. It's a separate item. And therefore, here it's certainly that you can't use this as a means to extrapolate that you need to kasher the glass. That's not going to be the case. Okay, that's a very important point. Let's now go to Seif Chaf Hey, 25. Kol kelei hashtiya, all drink utensils, ben tzlochiyot ben kosot, mutarim b'shtifa, you can just wash. Ben shem sizuchit, even certainly if they're glass, ben shem etz, ben shem matechet, ben shem heres, and even if they're wood and metal, even if they're earthenware. Ve'af al pi shedifamim notnim behem lechem ham, even if sometimes throughout the year I put in hot bread. I'll give you a great example of this. Right? In our home at least, we use our cups to drink cold water from. Sometimes the kids want to have some soup on Thursday night, the soup is cooking for Shabbat, and they come down, they're hungry, and they want to have some soup. So, get a whole bowl, sip a bit of soup to taste it. So you pour some soup into the cup, and that soup has croutons in it, that soup has bread in it, that soup has spaghetti in it, etc. Yeah? So that's hametz. No, it doesn't need to be kashed. Just wash it. Why? Because like we learned, because normally it's used for cold things. Can be washed. Because we always go after the majority. Says the Rama, our custom says the Rama is no, we don't do that, like we learned last week. But that's a really important point. All cups, the essence, the purpose of a cup is that it's drunk. You drink cold water, you drink liquids from it, normally cold liquids from it. Now, true. If you got what we have nowadays, our mugs. Okay, mugs need. If you regularly, again, even a mug. Think about it. I don't even think a mug would need kashering, because let's just work this out. A normal person, regular people, they use that.
How often do you have bread in your mug? You have coffee.
Exactly.
Once a blue moon, you have soup in it. You rough tashmi show. End of story. You just wash it.
You're right. If you're kind of person who regularly on a regular basis, puts in their tea, they put in their kind of stuff, hametz, they put whatever it is. If you're the kind of person who puts some porridge in your mug on a regular basis, then true, you have to kasher it. But you're right. If generally speaking, throughout the year, I use my mug just for coffee and for tea, on occasion I may have put hametz in. It doesn't need to be kasher either, it's hot. Because you go after Rosh Hashanah. Certainly cold cups, regular cups around the house, which we pour drink in and we drink water and drinks from, that doesn't need to be kashered at all. And that's really important to know. People, this is so important because people find Pesach difficult. because expense-wise, it's very difficult. It doesn't need to be. It's made to be much more expensive than it needs to be, I promise you. One can save so much money if one knows the halachot of hechsherim, what we learned a few weeks ago. And one knows the halachot of kashering, like we've learned, one can save themselves so much time, money, and effort. And therefore, this is really important what we're doing, to understand these principles. Therefore, all cups which you use throughout the year can be used on Pesach, full stop, essentially. And finally, Seif Chav Vav 26, Klei zechuchit, glass, afilu machisanikim, even if you kept hametz in it the whole year round, afilu if you used it with heat, en tzrichim shum hechsher sheinam bor'im b'shab ha'masagiru, they do not need any kashering and can just be washed. Says the Rama, v'yesh mahmirim v'omrim de klei zechuchit afilu hagala lo mani lahu. Some say, on the contrary, the glass is so porous, it's like earthenware, and you can't even do Hag'alat to it, and therefore you can't use glass utensils which you use throughout the year on Pesach at all. This is the custom amongst the Ashkenazim. This is the famous mahloket with the glass. For us Faradim, any glass, even with heat, is all permissible to be used. When Ashkenazim, they're stringent with it. And therefore, this is what I tell. Meat and milk is the same. I tell people who either struggle with kashrut, just buy a set of glass cutlery, glass crockery, and you can use that for meat and for milk, and you don't have to have two sets, and you can use that for Pesach as well, and that's all fine. That's absolutely fine. Okay, good. We got through a lot this evening. Next week will be our final shiur. Next week we go back. All our shiurim go back to 6 to 7 next week, B'ezrat Hashem. And throughout the summer will be 6 to 7. And we will be we'll quickly do some relevant points of 552 with regards to the timing of Hag'alat, and then go through some practical applications of all of these all this stuff. I've got a whole list of stuff which we can go through, all kinds. And if anything you want to discuss, you can send me in advance or on the night. We can go through and discuss how these things are kashed in practice nowadays. Okay, Hazak everyone, thank you for joining. We will continue B'ezrat Hashem next week at